So we'll be starting with Doug Schmidt. Doug Schmidt was one of the founding co-directors of the Data Science Institute. And I like to think that's his greatest achievement, but not, I know that it's not. He's Cornelius professor in computer science and has also was one of the co-authors on the prompt pattern paper. Lead author was Jules White that we've been teaching earlier in this symposium. Also, Doug was one of the early movers also on really experimenting, just like with Jules, with the possibility of ChatGPT and what this would mean in terms of computer science. He's also on the committee, the AI committee in the computer science department, and is going to be talking about applying ChatGPT to computer science courses at Vanderbilt. Thanks, Jesse.
So actually, my greatest achievement was helping to hire Jesse many years ago. So that's what I'm most proud of. So let's see, let's make sure this is, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about some of the experience I've had the last month, which seems like, they talk about dog years. So there's like LLM years. So a week is like 5 years in LLM years. And I'll be talking about some experiences we've had using ChatGPT in particular in the classes that I'm teaching here at Vanderbilt. So real quick, without going into a rabbit hole, I've been teaching courses for many years here at Vanderbilt on how to harness the power of multi-core processors in mobile devices and desktops and cloud environments in order to do processing more effectively. And it's a really fun topic, really interesting, obviously a lot of demand for that kind of stuff. This semester, we're building a movie recommendation web app using the outputs of BERT and other tools that Jesse has taught us over the years. So it's really fun. And the course I'm teaching is an upper level mezzanine course, which basically means that it can be sort of juniors, mostly seniors, and a few grad students. That is actually significant here because, oops, it says, unmute myself there. It's significant that it's a mezzanine course because it avoids a lot of the thorny issues that arise if you start trying to think about using ChatGPT in introductory courses. So I'm going to kind of skip over a lot of that stuff and just focus on teaching people who have some experience. So what am I doing with it right now? Well, for the past month, I've been using ChatGPT as my trusted AI advisor, but I trust but verify because half the time it gives me strange answers. And I'm using it to try to make more interesting programming assignments and more interesting examples in the classes that I'm teaching. And what I typically do is I try to find things that I never had time to learn before. And then I see whether ChatGPT can make me so productive that I can stay a couple steps ahead of my students and then teach it to them so they can learn it too. So one thing that I've done, I've worked on network programming for decades. I've worked on concurrent and parallel programming for decades. Never really worked much with databases. That was a big gap in my learning. And as a consequence, I don't know much about it. And so when I taught those topics in my class, I'd usually have to go and say, hey, Jules, can you show me how to do X, Y, and Z? But that doesn't scale very well because Jules has his own things he's working on. So I decided to see if I could get ChatGPT to teach me the stuff I need to know. And what was interesting about that was I never would have done this without this tool because I don't have a month or two to learn this stuff the old school way of searching on websites and things like that.
Yeah. I fixed the screen because it's not showing.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. So one of the things I did, of course, was I used ChatGPT's natural language processing capabilities to ask how you do certain things, like how do you write a certain type of database query using the web technology that we're doing. And because of the way that it works, I was able to ask that question and it gave me a nice response. And then I also was able to use it to go a little deeper. So just having these APIs generated is nice, but sometimes you need to know more because you want to teach your students how things work under the hood. So I'm also able to take the output from ChatGPT, which then I compile, and I can say, what's the actual underlying SQL query that's responsible for doing this stuff? And lo and behold, now I can learn SQL. And I never had to take a class on it, but I know enough now to be able to teach it to my students, which is great. I've also done some other interesting things here. Whoops. I use it to generate sample code using techniques I really wasn't aware of. And why is that? It's because I typically learn what I need to do in order to teach my class, but I don't read every single API and every single manual page. I just learn the stuff I need to know. ChatGPT, on the other hand, is much more thorough than I am. So it'll read every page in the manual. It'll read every API. So as a consequence, it knows how to do things like generate custom SQL queries, which is something I had no idea how to do. It also knows how to generate all the other gobbledygook you need to be an effective programmer. It generates the import files to bring in the right libraries you depend on. Another great thing, it generates comments. If you spend much time programming, you know that nobody likes to write comments. It's terrible. But ChatGPT can reverse engineer your code and write very descriptive comments, usually better than I would do because I get impatient. And it'll describe those things. And then I can make my students feel guilty for not writing comments because I'm commenting on my code nicely. And of course, I show them to do the same thing so they can generate comments this way too. And there's other stuff you have to do when you write programs. You have to generate dependencies on libraries and other frameworks, which is something that's typically rather mystical and mystifying. So ChatGPT works very well in that respect. Some other things that happen, students will oftentimes give me very clever solutions. And I'm thinking to myself, gosh, I don't know what their code does. And I could spend a couple hours trying to ferret it out, again, look back to the manual pages and so on. But why do that? I cut and paste their code into ChatGPT. Boom, it comes back with a nice summary at whatever level of detail I need it to give me. And not only do I get to understand what they're doing, I can then say, why don't you regenerate this code with a different paradigm? Take the object-oriented version and give me the functional version, or give me the reactive version. So all of a sudden I can be conversant in brand spanking new technologies. And I can also do this in multiple languages. I'm primarily a Java, C++, C type of person, but all of a sudden I'm a Python person because I can take the code that spits out in C++ or Java and turn it into Python. That's a pretty popular language. So I could probably hire a grad student to do that for me, or an undergrad. But what if I had to write code in something esoteric like Ada? There's probably nobody within maybe a 50-mile radius here that knows how to program Ada. If you go to Huntsville, there'll be people who know how to program in Ada. But around here, no way. But boom, I can write the code in Ada. I learned Ada as the second programming language in 1987. But I haven't done it in about 25, 30 years. So it would take me a long time to get back up to speed with this, but ChatGPT did it instantaneously. One of the other concerns we always have is, well, this is great. ChatGPT is generating all this code, but does it really work? And that's an interesting question. But one thing you can do with ChatGPT is get it to generate unit tests. So it's actually pretty easy to check to see whether the unit tests are testing what you want them to test. And then you can use that to check to see whether the generated code is working properly as well. Something else that's important, people occasionally ask me questions about design or programming that I'm moderately familiar with, but I don't remember off the top of my head. So someone asked me the other day, why did you choose to use an aggregation approach to your design rather than a composition approach? And I was like, composition, aggregation. I remember that from 30 years ago when I took my object-oriented design class, but I had to be an instant expert, right? So I said, ChatGPT, please give me an example showing the difference between composition and aggregation in Java. And it put out this code. Once I looked at it, I'm like, oh yeah, of course, that's what it was. I kind of knew that, but it would have taken me hours to reverse engineer it myself. So it made me appear much more on top of my game to when people ask me questions that need quick responses. And by the way, I should also mention quickly, I do a lot of work with teams of people on Zoom, like I'm sure all of you do. And nothing is more impressive when you're talking amongst yourselves, trying to figure out something, and you quickly look up in ChatGPT and it comes back with a nice synopsis. And you're like, well, let me tell you how we can think about this problem from the 5 key perspectives. And like, how did you know that? So that's why you don't always want to screen share. So a couple of things to wrap up. That was some examples of how I'm using it in my class. But if I step back and think more generally about using ChatGPT, my philosophy at this point is to encourage my students to use these tools rather than discourage them in my classes. And that has a couple of dimensions. It requires rethinking the assignments. It requires rethinking the quizzes and the exams that I give. Like many of you, perhaps, we moved to almost everything online during the pandemic. And it's really nice not to have to spend time in class writing answers with pen and paper that you then have to try to read. Horrible. So we do almost everything through Brightspace, but that leads to some obvious problems. So one thing I try to do to get around the fact that some students may be motivated to use ChatGPT in ways that violate the honor code, I try to come up with ways to make my assignments more open-ended. So rather than giving them very detailed steps, I give them broad steps and then expect them to use ChatGPT to fill in the blanks, and also teach them what happens when it goes awry, because it doesn't always give you the right answer. Likewise, I also make my quizzes and exams harder to use, even if they're incorrectly or unfairly using ChatGPT. So one clever thing I've been doing is making my questions very contextual. So I have discussions in class And the quiz questions come from the class discussions. So good luck finding that on ChatGPT in quite the same way you'd find it if it was just memorization of slides. So that helps a little bit, not perfect, but it helps a bit. It also encourages people to come to class. And the other thing that I do is I ask questions using techniques that have been promoted since September 2021. So there's lots of new APIs that come along. This is the great thing about programming. If I was doing archaeology or ancient history from Europe or something like that, it'd be a lot harder to do that. But if I'm doing something with Spring, there are new features that came out just recently. I also want students to know the pros and cons of all this stuff. As you might expect, I'm sure this has been talked about many times, ChatGPT is quite good at topics it's been trained on. So if you ask questions in Python or Java or JavaScript, it's going to know the answers. Not quite so good on things where there's limited resources or limited training. And even when there are resources, it sometimes hallucinates there as well, but at least you have a fighting chance. So the basic point there is I want to use it to supplement rather than supplant the learning process, which I think is exactly how we're going to be doing this. It'll be an augmented cognition kind of thing. So to wrap up, why does this matter? Why does using AI tools matter? Well, it matters because the current way we build software, which is largely people doing an awful lot of the work, is quickly, in fact, more quickly than we might have realized, being replaced by a model where humans and AI tools work together in a trustworthy, collaborative way. And there's actually a report that you can't see here, but we'll give you the slides because it's included by the screen sharing, that talked about this about a year and a half ago from a group I work with at Carnegie Mellon. And they were visionary. Of course, we had no idea that this was going to happen, but we're going to take credit for it, about humans and AI working together collaboratively. So the idea is to be able to work with programmer intent rather than getting wrapped up in around the axle of low-level programming tools. Everyone is about to become a programmer, whether you realize it or not. All future civilization will be populated by people who program by doing prompt engineering. You can read the papers that Jules has talked about before. So we might as well get good at that. And the real goal here, to avoid being displaced and disintermediated, is to refocus on things that require creativity and a more architectural perspective, which ChatGPT is not very good at yet, but probably will be good soon, and allow us to do stuff rather than having to deal with obfuscated, mundane details. If you really want to amuse yourself, take the output of the obfuscated C code contest winners on an annual basis and give that to ChatGPT and see whether it can figure out what it does. It's actually surprisingly good, which is kind of scary. Okay, so that's my talk. Over to you.